You wake before dawn to the sound of boots on stone. The air smells of sweat, oil, and fear. You're 12 years old, far from home, and you've just realized that the man who promised to teach you how to survive this legion is standing too close. His hand is on your shoulder. His breath is warm against your neck, and there is no one coming to help you. Before we go deeper into this story, I'd love to drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It amazes me every single day that a tragedy buried for 2,000 years can reach every corner of the globe, connecting us across time. This was the reality for thousands of boys across the Roman Empire, in the shadows of back alleys. But within the most disciplined, most celebrated institution in ancient history, the Roman legions, we've been told stories of honor, of brotherhood forged in battle, of men who built an empire with iron and blood. But beneath the eagle's standards and the glory of conquest, there existed a parallel world, one that Roman historians chose not to write about, that military commanders preferred to ignore, and that victims carried in silence until their deaths. The year is 127 AD. Emperor Hadrian rules from Britannia to the deserts of Arabia. In a fortress along the Rhine frontier, home to 5,000 soldiers, a 14-year-old recruit named Quintus has just arrived. He comes from a small farming village in Hispania. He cannot read. He has never held a gladius. His father sold him into military service to pay off debts. He will serve for 25 years, if he survives. What the official records won't tell you is this. Within his first 6 months, Quintus will be sexually assaulted by 3 different men. One will be a fellow recruit, one will be a decanus, a squad leader, and one will be a centurion, an officer whose word is law, whose favor can mean survival, and whose anger can mean death. This is not a story Romans wanted preserved, but it survived anyway. Graffiti scratched into barrack walls, in letters smuggled out by terrified boys, in medical records that documented injuries too specific to ignore, and in rare legal cases where the violence became too public, too brutal, or too politically inconvenient to suppress. Let's be precise about what we're discussing, because Roman sexuality operated under a moral framework completely alien to modern understanding. Romans did not categorize people as heterosexual or homosexual. They categorized them as penetrator or penetrated. The former was masculine, honorable, a demonstration of power. The latter was shameful, feminizing, a status reserved for slaves, prostitutes, and conquered enemies. For a freeborn Roman boyespish, one serving in the legions, to be forced into the passive role was not merely assault, it was symbolic castration. It was the destruction of his legal and social standing as a man. It transformed him from a future citizen soldier into something Romans had a very specific word for. Sine dussa, man who submits sexually, who has forfeited his right to respect, to command, to honor. And yet, this is exactly what happened to countless boys within the military system designed to turn them into Rome's greatest warriors. The structure of legion life created the perfect conditions for systematic abuse. New recruits, often as young as 12 or 13, though officially the minimum age was 17, arrived alone, frightened and utterly powerless. They were assigned to contubernia, 8-man tent groups that functioned as the basic social unit of the legion. These boys shared sleeping quarters, bathed together, trained together, and depended entirely on senior soldiers for protection, food, and knowledge. The concept of mentorship, what Romans called the tyrrhenium, was supposed to be sacred. A veteran would adopt a young recruit, teach him weapon skills, introduce him to legion traditions, and shield him from the harshness of military discipline. In exchange, the recruit offered obedience, loyalty, and service. But the line between mentorship and exploitation was dangerously thin, and it was crossed constantly. Archaeological evidence from military sites across the empire reveals the hidden architecture of abuse in the fortress of Vindolanda in northern Britannia. Excavations uncovered hundreds of wooden tablets, letters, and records preserved in the anaerobic mud. Among routine supply requests and duty rosters, archaeologists found something else: desperate pleas from young soldiers. One tablet, dated to approximately 100 AD, reads, "To my brother Marcus, who I have not seen since the autumn rains, I beg you to speak to the tribune. Decanus Gaius comes to my bed when the others sleep. I have told him I do not wish it. He says if I refuse again, he will report me for cowardice. I would rather die in battle than continue this. Your brother, Titus." The letter was never sent. It was found in a drainage ditch behind the barracks, torn into pieces. This was not an isolated incident. Graffiti preserved on barrack walls from Germania to Syria tells the same story in cruder terms. In Duri Ropos, a fortress on the Euphrates, someone scratched into the plaster, "Lucius took me by force. May his sword break in battle." In a fort near modern-day Budapest, the centurion makes boys of us all. In Lambassus, North Africa, I was a man when I arrived. I am something else now. The most chilling aspect, many of these inscriptions include the names of commanding officers, suggesting either that the abuse was too normalized to hide, or that victims hoped future generations might bear witness to what they endured. The mechanics of abuse within the legions followed predictable patterns. The most vulnerable were new recruits during their first year. The Tyrones, who had not yet learned the informal networks of protection, who didn't know which officers to avoid, who were desperate to prove themselves and terrified of punishment. Predators exploited this systematically. A common tactic was to offer special protection to a frightened boy, framing sexual access as a transaction. "Stay close to me, do as I say. I'll make sure the others don't hurt you." The boy, isolated and desperate, would often comply on understanding that he was trading one form of violation for another. Another pattern involved alcohol. Military rations included a daily wine allowance, and drinking was central to Legion culture. Veterans would invite young recruits to private celebrations, get them drunk, and assault them while they were incapacitated. By morning, the boy would wake disoriented, in pain, and utterly confused about whether he had somehow consented. The barracks layout facilitated this. Officers had private quarters, but ordinary soldiers slept in cramped, dark contubernia where 8 men shared a space barely 12 feet wide. Privacy was non-existent. If an assault happened at night, everyone knew. And everyone stayed silent either, because they feared retaliation, or because they had been victims themselves and had learned that speaking up changed nothing. Medical evidence supports this reality. A papyrus fragment from an Egyptian legion's medical records, dated to 156 AD, documents 14 cases of anal trauma among recruits in a single year. The legion physician noted the injuries with clinical detachment. Excessive tearing, consistent with forced penetration, applied honey and wine compress. Soldier returned to duty after 3 days. Returned to duty, not protected, not removed from danger. Just patched up and sent back into the same environment. The most devastating aspect of this abuse was not the physical trauma, though, that was severe, but the psychological destruction. Roman military culture worshipped masculine honor. A soldier's identity was built on strength, courage, and dominance. To be sexually subjugated shattered that identity completely. Victims faced an impossible choice: report the abuse and face public humiliation, or remain silent and endure ongoing violation. Roman law technically protected soldiers from sexual assault. The Lex Julia Divina Publica, enacted under Augustus, made it a capital crime to rape a Roman citizen. But enforcement was a bitter joke. To bring charges, a victim had to publicly testify about the assault in front of his entire unit. He had to describe in explicit detail what had been done to him. He had to admit that he had been penetrated, that he had been made into a fetus. Even if his attacker was convicted and executed, the victim's honor could never be restored. He would be marked for life. And if the attacker was an officer, if he had connections, wealth, or the favor of the commander, the victim would not only lose his case, he might be punished for making false accusations. The Roman military code prescribed brutal penalties for insubordination: flogging with vine staffs that could shatter ribs, fustuarium, beating to death by fellow soldiers, or decimatio, execution of every 10th man in a unit. So victims stayed silent. They internalized the shame. They developed what we would now recognize as complex PTSD, depression, rage, self-harm, substance abuse. Some sought oblivion in the violence of battle, fighting with suicidal recklessness. Others turned their trauma outward, becoming abusers themselves, perpetuating the cycle. A heartbreaking testament to this cycle comes from the frontier fort of Carnuntum in Pannonia. Archaeologists discovered a soldier's tomb dated to 170 A.D. with an unusual epitaph. Here lies Marcus Antonius Valens, who served 12 years and died by his own hand. He could no longer carry what was done to him. May the gods have mercy, for his comrades had none. His comrades had none. There were moments when the violence became too egregious to ignore, when the abuse crossed boundaries that even the cynical pragmatism of Roman military culture couldn't tolerate. These cases offer rare glimpses into the institutional response, and what they reveal is damning. In 89 AD, during the reign of Domitian, a scandal erupted in a legion stationed in Mysia. A centurion named Gaius Plotius had been systematically abusing recruits for years, selecting boys based on physical beauty and keeping them in a state of sexual servitude. He branded them with his personal marker practice, usually reserved for slaves, and loaned them to other officers. The abuse might have continued indefinitely, except that one of his victims was the nephew of a senator. When the boy's family discovered what had happened, they leveraged their political connections to force an investigation. The resulting trial was a public spectacle. Witnesses testified to years of atrocities. The legion's medical records were subpoenaed. The evidence was overwhelming. Gaius Plotius was convicted and sentenced to death. But here's what's telling. He was executed not for raping children, but for conduct unbecoming an officer and undermining military discipline. The trial transcripts, preserved in fragments, barely mention the victims. The focus was entirely on whether Plotius had damaged the legion's effectiveness and reputation. And after his execution, life continued as before. There was no systemic reform, no new protocols to protect vulnerable recruits, no acknowledgement that the structure of military life itself enabled abuse. The message was clear. Individual monsters would occasionally be punished, but the system would not change. Some boys found ways to survive. They formed protective alliances with other victims, creating informal networks where they watched out for each other. They learned which officers to avoid, which duties kept them away from predators, which times of day were most dangerous. A few found protectors older soldiers who, whether out of genuine compassion or their own complex motives, shielded younger recruits from harm. These relationships were complicated, often transactional, and occasionally evolved into the consensual mentor relationships that Roman culture celebrated. But even then, the power imbalance was absolute. The luckiest victims were those who survived long enough to gain rank and seniority themselves, to become veterans who could no longer be easily victimized. Some used their position to protect the next generation of recruits. Others, tragically, became predators themselves, reenacting their trauma on new victims in a grim cycle of abuse. And some simply waited for their 25 years of service to end, carrying their trauma in silence until they could return to civilian life and try to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, though the letters and tombstones suggest that many never truly escaped. What makes this history particularly painful is how thoroughly it was erased. Roman historians like Livy Tacitus and Josephus wrote extensively about military life, but they documented strategy, battles, and political intrigue. They didn't write about the 12-year-old boy crying himself to sleep in a barracks, or the 16-year-old recruit who threw himself on an enemy sword rather than return to his centurion's tent. The erasure was deliberate. Rome's national mythology depended on the image of legions as paragons of masculine virtue, disciplined, honorable, incorruptible. Acknowledging systematic sexual abuse within the military would have shattered that myth. So it was ignored in official histories, minimized in legal records, and dismissed as isolated incidents rather than structural rot. But the boys themselves left evidence. They scratched their pain into walls. They wrote letters they couldn't send. They made offerings at temples, begging gods for justice or deliverance. They told their stories to a handful of sympathetic witnesses, lectors, letter writers, occasionally a rare commander who cared. And across to millennia, in the fragments they left behind, we can still hear their voices. One final story deserves to be told. A small rebellion that suggests not all victims accepted their fate silently. In 132 AD, during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, a Roman legion stationed near Jerusalem experienced an unusual pattern of casualties. 7 centurions died within a 3-month period, not in battles with Jewish rebels, but in accidents. One fell from a watchtower. Another was crushed when a siege weapon malfunctioned. A third was found at the bottom of a ravine, his death attributed to a drunken stumble. A military investigation eventually revealed the truth. A group of young soldiers, all victims of sexual abuse by these officers, had conspired to kill them. They orchestrated the accidents carefully, ensuring each death appeared isolated and plausible. They were caught only when one conspirator, consumed by guilt, confessed to a military chaplain. The punishment was swift and theatrical. All 12 conspirators were crucified along the road leading to the fortress, their bodies left to rot as a warning against mutiny. But before his execution, one of them, a 19-year-old named Sextus, reportedly said, "You can kill us, but you cannot make us regret it. We stopped monsters. Our only regret is that we didn't stop them sooner." The incident was quietly buried in military records, classified as a mutiny rather than a justified response to abuse. But in a fort thousands of miles away, someone heard about it and carved a message into a barrack wall. Sextus and his brothers remembered. This is what Rome chose not to remember: the legion fortresses filled with ghosts, boys who should have become men but were broken before they had the chance. Their trauma built no monuments. Their suffering earned no triumphs. History granted them no dignity, only the cold consolation that some small fragments of their pain survived, waiting in the mud and stone for someone to finally listen. We remember them now. We bear witness to what was done in the shadow of the eagle's standards. We say their names when we can find them, and we honor their silence when we cannot. Because they were there, they endured, and they deserved so much better than the empire they served.